Welcome to Brain Pain, where we discuss everything psychology. My name's John, and I start every podcast by reminding you I am not a therapist. I am just a guy with a master's degree in psychology working on a PsyD, which is a doctoral degree in psychology. Nothing I say here today is meant to replace therapy. That's important. I'm going to talk about some things that may kind of sound like that today, but it is in no way a way to replace therapy. They're just some ideas and some thoughts that I have from personal experience and study. So let's get into today. I want to talk about anxiety, and this ties into depression and a number of other things. I want to talk about them because I've just done a couple podcasts on coping mechanisms and how to cope, and just touched on a few things. But we had this concept. I've had in the last week, I've had at least 3 conversations that were very similar, and it was about feeling anxiety. And they all basically came down to the same thing. It was me telling people that, well, quote, normal, I'm going to put normal in parentheses, normal people feel anxiety too. They feel depression too. They feel these things. Now, I'm not talking about to the point where we're clinically depressed. I'm saying that we go through periods of depression. It's normal. You have all the symptoms of depression. They just don't last for normal people. You feel anxiety on a regular basis. I know myself, dealing with some work stuff, I had about 2 days of a lot of anxiety just because I was trying to do the right thing and I didn't know how that was going to work out. And it worked out well at the end. So, I felt all this anxiety, but still, I did my job. And eventually, everything worked out. At least that time. It doesn't always work out the way we want it, and we know that. But I think the big thing is first to realize that everybody feels it. Everybody feels anxiety. Everybody has days that they're sad, even if they don't call it depression. There are periods of time where we feel a lot of depression. There are times when you should feel depressed, right? You lose a loved one. A pet passes away. For me, a lot of that ties around loss. Your job doesn't, something bad happens at work. You're going to feel sad. You're going to feel anxiety. You're going to feel all of these emotions. We all do. And something I found myself talking about in these conversations were a couple of books. Now, I have no affiliation with these authors, other than I've read their books. I have no sponsorship on this. But the first book that came to mind was Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And this was by Susan Jeffers. It's still for sale on Amazon. It's probably in a later edition. You can get versions of it through thrift books for, I think, anywhere from $4 up to $12. I think new it's $20. And it's really a book worth reading, because it talks about the fact that you're going to feel these emotions. There's also, I was going to say Steven Pressfield, which I'm going to cite 2 of his books. War of Art, which is specifically originally written really towards anybody trying to accomplish something, and it talks about all the things that can get in the way of you trying to accomplish anything, whether it's art or starting a business or anything like that. And he has another one called Do the Work. Both of these address things that keep you from functioning and doing the things you feel you should be doing. They're both great books. As a matter of fact, for Steven Pressfield, any of his self-development books I would highly recommend, and I enjoyed a lot of his fiction. He's written some great historical fiction, just as a side note. Steven Pressfield, if you're ever listen to this, just know that I appreciate all the books that you've written, because I've read, I think, almost all of them. Anyway, the issue that people have who have anxiety or have depression is that they can't get out of that loop. It becomes debilitating. It stops them from functioning normally. So ideally, in a hypothetical situation, 2 people could have the exact same emotion and they perceive it in the exact same intensity, and one of them seems to function fine and the other doesn't. Now, part of this is coping, right? Like I said, I've talked about coping and coping skills and coping techniques and therapies. But I think one of the things that is really common in my personal, and this is anecdotal, this is not from studies, is that people who are dealing with anxiety and depression tend to isolate themselves, and they end up spiraling down into a negative loop. So one of the things I often suggest is go out and get around people. Get around people. And the reason I say this is not because of, is for a reason that you might not suspect I would come up with. But I've mentioned before about group therapies. As I've said before, you have organized group therapies and you have kind of organically developed, spontaneous group therapies. I'm going to speak shortly about addiction because I'm going to say that the group therapy concept, this is one of those things that shows itself in beating addiction. When people go into recovery, I won't say never, but it's rarely alone. They're usually in a group, a support group of some sort that helps them understand that they're not alone, that they're not the only people that feel these things. And there is something to be said about being around other people. The worst times of my life have been when I've been isolated for long periods of time. We are supposed to be around other people, in my opinion. If you find yourself spending all of your time alone and you're depressed and you're anxious, it's probably being fed by the fact you're alone. There may be other factors. You may need clinical help. But being alone all the time isn't going to help. So now that I've said that, for those of you who are anxious and depressed and maybe you're even seeking clinical help, but you're struggling still and there's a lot of problems and you're around people, take a hard look at the people you're around. Do they feed what's best in you? Now, there are studies that show the people you surround yourself with make a difference in your life and your outcomes. As I've said before, I'm going to try and stop using the term being happy because happy is a temporary state. I'm going to talk about being satisfied. If you're going to live a satisfying life, you not only need to be around people, but you need to be around the right people. And I don't mean yes men. I don't mean that you need to be around people who always tell you you're right or any of that or always pump you up, because you need people who genuinely love you and care for you and know that they need to pump you up and feed you positive thoughts, but also know to call you out when you are being self-destructive or you're pursuing an avenue that does not appear to be in your best interest. I've been very fortunate. As a Navy veteran myself, I have some Navy buddies who will call me out on it in the harshest terms. But I listen and I'm not offended, no matter what names they call me. Because I know these guys. I know that if they are calling me out on something, they're trying to keep me honest because they love me and they care about me. Now, when we talk about being around the right people, that means that you may have to cut out people. You may have to get away from certain people. And do not replace them with the same type of people. This is harder than it sounds, because we have a tendency to be drawn to the same types of groups. We tend to go where we feel comfortable and familiar. And that, again, ties back to anxiety and feeling those fear feelings, those negative feelings about places we aren't comfortable. We may be comfortable in a terrible situation. That's how you get codependency. That's how you get people who are in terrible, terrible relationships. That's how people end up dating people who are bad for them over and over, or getting into bad marriages over and over, is because we tend to seek out, if we're not consciously seeking people out, we seek out people that are similar to the people that we've known before, that we have a comfort level around because it is familiar, even if it is terrible. So you have to find the right people. And this may even tie into cutting out toxic family members. Now, I may have to do a whole podcast on that because, wow, that's not easy. That's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to even think about. So I'm not going to go any further into that. But what I am going to say is find the people that feed you what you need, not necessarily what you want. That feed you what you need, not necessarily what you're comfortable with. That's a lot of work. And for me, it's a lot of work for me to just say that and then move on. But I think that again, that's a whole podcast by itself, getting the right people in your life. And what you'll find is that if you are trying to do something to help others, often you find the right people. Like I said, we'll have to talk about doing that on a future podcast, a whole thing about getting the right people in your life. But John, you say, how do I get around people if I'm anxious, if I can't deal with people, if I don't know what to say, if I don't know what to do? Now, again, I'm going to assume that these are just normal people who aren't, let me rephrase that. I'm going to assume these are the right people for this part of the conversation. People that will feed you good things, people that you at least want to get to know to see if they're the right people. I don't do well in social situations. Some people have debilitating social anxiety, and you're going to have to go to therapy, and you're going to have to work through it. You might even need medication, and I accept that. But let me tell you a couple tricks for going to a social event when you have a lot of anxiety. Let's say you're going to a get-together, and you know people are going to be there. I don't know. Let's just do an example of a festival, right? I was once told that was the most terrifying thing that a person I knew went to. They wanted to go to a blues festival because they loved blues music and they loved live blues music, but they just struggle around that many people to go see all the shows. And I just asked him, I said, well, what would you consider a quote, safe amount of time to go to a festival? And I didn't get an answer right away. They thought about it, and they told me they found that, around the 2-hour mark was as much as they could take. That was just too much social stimulation. Once they hit 2 hours, they had to go and have time to decompress and to process and to do all those things to feel okay. But the festival lasts 8 hours. Okay. And my friends are going to go for 8 hours. They want to go to the whole thing. Okay. Well, how about if 2 hours is your limit, you just go separately. You drive separately, make sure you have your transportation organized, whatever you need to do. And just tell them, hey, I'm only going to go for a couple hours. I want to see this one show, and then I have to go. I've got other things I got to get taken care of. So now you show up, you're feeling a little anxious, but in 2 hours, you're going to leave. They expect you to leave in 2 hours. And then, when you do, nobody's like, oh, it's the most you should get if they're good friends is just, oh, it's too bad you can't stay. We'd love for you to stay. And just take that as them showing you that they love you, and then go ahead and leave anyway. If it's an hour, do it for an hour. And it's the same thing if you have people that are just getting together at somebody's house and you'd kind of like to go, but you feel like you'd be stuck. Just when you show up, say, hey, I can only stay for a half an hour. I can only stay for an hour, whatever it is. So that you've set your boundaries, and now they expect you to leave at that point. But what if I find out I want to stay longer? That's what you asked me. You said, John, what if I find out I want to stay longer? Well, you simply say, I'll just have to rearrange things. I'm going to stay for another half hour. But you set that next time limit, right? Or an hour. And then go and process and do what you need to do. But just set the boundary at the beginning. Like I say, hey, let's go to, I don't know, the garlic festival. We'll go eat some garlic ice cream. Ugh. I'm not sure I can do that. But, you know, you're going to the garlic festival. Hey, I can only stop. I'll meet you guys up there. I'm only going to stay for about an hour, but I'll be glad to see you guys up there. Oh, okay, great. We'll see you there. So that's just there's 100 other techniques, but that's just one that I have given to friends of mine that found it works pretty well. If we, you know, get-togethers with your family, especially if your family's toxic, but you still want to be around them because you love them, just tell them, hey, I'm only stopping by for an hour. And then if they try to get you to, they'll try all the tricks to make you stay, just tell them, I got to go, and go. If you do that a couple times, they'll get used to it. They may complain about it. They may give you a hard time about it, but just let it go. And I know that's easier said than done. I understand. But if you set expectations, you'll find that the normalization that those around you find with you only coming for a little while works. And if it doesn't, you need to really look at those people again. I mean, a lot of them love you and they just want to be around you more. But that's feeding them, that's not feeding you. And remember that, even if they think it is. Even if they say, oh, well, no, it's really good for you to stay out for a little bit longer. No, it's not. You know, they don't. And just tell them thanks for caring and then move on. Now, if it's debilitating, that's a whole different story. We all know this. So let's talk about you hit the point where you just don't feel you can do anything because of your anxiety or because of depression or those types of things. Now, we've talked, there's various therapies if it's really that severe for long periods of time. But just about everybody that I've known has hit a point in their life at some point where they just can't do it. They have no motivation. They don't want to go anywhere. They don't want to do anything. They can't get their laundry done. They don't want to cook. Just that whole thing, that depressive state. Or they're frozen by anxiety. Again, there's various therapies out there. There's various coping tools. But when it really gets down to it, what works for me is just doing the next thing. Separate from the whole, right? So I've got to clean my house. Well, sometimes that just seems overwhelming. It's just too much. Can't do it. But you know what I can do? I can, pick up the dirty laundry off the floor and just put it in a bag, in the laundry bag. I didn't clean the house. So do the next thing. Do the next right thing, the next step. Don't clean the whole house, just clean that table. Just load the dishwasher. That one thing. Then you can let yourself go. But you might find there's one more thing, so let's just do that one thing. And then you can stop at any time. It comes back to that concept of how do you eat an elephant? If you have an elephant that you had to eat, how do you eat it? Well, you can't eat it all at once. It's going to do one bite at a time. And I think, especially when we talk about projects or things that we need to do or want to do, we get overwhelmed. I mean, this podcast is one of those things. If I think about all the stuff that I have to do for this podcast, it can get overwhelming, and I might not even start it. But instead, I just sit down and I do the first step, and then I do the second step, and I do the third step, and then there might be a break before I can get to the fourth step, but I get it done. But for a while, and that whole time between the first season of this podcast and this season, there was a break, and it was longer than it should have been simply because it was overwhelming when I thought about it, on top of all the other things I'm doing. I work a full-time job, which is pretty intense. I'm working on my PsyD, which is also pretty intense. I mean, a doctorate level coursework is pretty intense, especially when you don't have the time you might if you were a full-time student. But you got to get through it. And then to do the podcast. and to have time with friends, and to make sure, I call my parents, and to make sure all the other things I have to do in life. It all gets overwhelming. But I just do the next thing. Separate from the whole. And that's the key for me. I don't think about loading the dishwasher as part of cleaning the kitchen. I say, hey, all I got to do is load the dishwasher. Right? It takes 5 minutes. And I think what people don't realize is if you just do you feel the anxiety, you feel the fear, and you go do the things that you need to go do, you become, the anxiety doesn't go away, but you become desensitized to it. You become able to function because it doesn't grip you and it doesn't stop you. You're able to function because you're used to it. You understand that that's just a feeling. The feeling doesn't necessitate a result. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around sometimes because your feelings can overwhelm you in a perfectly safe and non-threatening environment. We have these emotions that we've developed, and then we're in a society where now they have more power than maybe they used to for a lot more people, simply because we've gotten away from, in a very short amount of time, if you look at all of history, we've gotten away from the reason that those emotions were important. We used to be part of close-knit clubs, groups, clans, tribes, whatever. But we were part of a group of people. And in modern day society, we stress this whole idea of the individual, which there is a lot of benefit to making sure that each individual can reach the peak of their existence with a satisfying life where they were able to really develop their talents and reach goals. That's all important. But if you're not doing it in the context of a group, you may feel unfulfilled. You may not be satisfied. Currently with social media, there's a lot of great things that come from social media, but there's also this illusion that I'm connected to people through social media that might disappear tomorrow. Now, before you think I'm just going to say, oh, social media is terrible, you have to realize there was a guy who was, I'll call him an acquaintance, but he was a good acquaintance. I liked the guy. And he passed last week. And it hit me because I'd spent a number of hours talking with this guy. When I was traveling, I would get on video chat with a group of people, and he was one of them. And we would just talk. It wasn't anything specific, but we developed an actual friendship over the years that was more than just the surface stuff that you do online so much, right? On the other hand, social media allows us just to dump all this, quote, social interaction that is so superficial, but it makes us feel like we're connected to other people, right? And we look at all these likes and views and all the ratings that we get on social media, and we start to tie that into our self-worth. Well, we're not all going to be rock stars. We're not all going to be great actors. We're not all going to be famous. Most of us will live quiet lives where a vast majority of people who live will never know about us. Now, if that scares you, that means that social media is not doing you any good. Because the reality is, if A majority of people who will ever live do not know John and brain pain. There's some freedom in that. That means I can be me because it doesn't matter. The only feedback I'm getting is from a handful of people, even if I get thousands or millions of people to respond to me. In the span of history, in the entirety of the human existence for whatever that is, it's a blip. It's a number that doesn't matter. People we think of as famous today, people won't know who they are in 50 or 100 years. And if you don't believe me, think about who is your favorite artist from 1920? Musical artist. $1930. Right? It's not even 100 years ago yet. It's like 1920 would be 101 years ago. And all those people who are famous living these big, famous people lifestyles. Nobody knows who they are. We remember a handful of people, good and bad, right? We remember Gandhi. We remember Hitler. We remember George Washington. But people outside the United States may or may not know who George Washington is. Oscar Wilde. Handful of people. Millions and billions of people have lived. And we remember a handful from over 100 years ago. And most of those aren't, all of those aren't from over 100 years ago. Right? Billions and billions of people have lived. And we don't even remember any but a handful that have lived in the last 100 years. Comparatively. So there's freedom in that. You don't have to be anything you're not. And you can work to become the person you want to be. But don't let others decide what that should be. That feeds into that anxiety. That feeds that anxiety. That's the whole point of all this is if you have a need to write great music, it will be because you need to write great music. It won't be because you need the fame of writing great music. And if you feel a burning desire that you need to be famous, it's because you're buying other people's dreams. Because the need to be famous just to be famous. I want to point out, I read an article about a common thing that happens to rock musicians back in the day when they would get famous and make a ton of money. You have these guys that work for 20 years, 10 years, whatever, working hard, playing small venues. And all of a sudden one of their records blows up and they're this huge band and they get all this money. And so they do what they think they're supposed to. They go buy these big mansions. And often in the first year that they live in that mansion, they have this huge house and they live in one room. Like all their stuff's in like a living room. They sleep there, they eat there, they do their music, they watch television, whatever it is they do it in this one room for a vast majority of the time. And it's because, you know, they'd lived in apartments, single room apartments up to that point, or small apartments up to that point. And what happens is they're still them. Getting rich and famous doesn't make you, it reveals you. So even if you are a person who feels a need to be famous, or a person who has to write great music, just remember you're still going to be you. You're still going to be you. So take the time to make sure you are the you that you want to be. And know that you're going to feel fear, you're going to feel anxiety, you're going to feel depression. It's going to be part of your life. But find ways to cope with it. Find out what works with you. And if you need therapy, get therapy. If you need help, get help. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this podcast the way I always do. Remember that I love you. Take care of yourselves. And rock on.